I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 31, The Enemy Reappears. The brood nest lay deep underground, a depth difficult for ordinary ants to reach without specialized digging limbs. To address this, Luo Wen constructed a temporary nest above the brood nest. This structure served not only as a logistics hub but also as a decoy, the first line of defense for the true nest. The distance between ant nest number 1 and the brood nest was about 50 meters, roughly the same length as the smuggling tunnel leading to ant nest number 2. With his prior experience, this project posed no challenge for Luo Wen. After spending some time completing the tunnel, the brood nest resumed siphoning food from ant nest number 1. With 2 nests supplying resources, the brood nest's food reserves began increasing visibly. The hatchery became fully stocked, and even the storage chambers Luo Wen had excavated earlier started filling with food. From then on, Luo Wen's daily routine consisted of hauling enough food from both nests to meet the transport team's capacity for the day. After that, he expanded his scouting range. Time passed, and Luo Wen's body grew significantly larger, now comparable in size to the war god black beetle he encountered before. Although he lacked the massive mandibles, his combat strength was enough to handle a soldier ant in one-on-one combat. His bulk now exceeded that of soldier ants, and his rounded physique made their slender frames appear feeble in comparison. Apart from their sharper mandibles, soldier ants resembled oversized worker ants. Without the advantage of size, they were no match for Luo-style insect combat techniques. Near ant nest number 1, Luo Wen set a trap and, with a large team of minions, ambushed a soldier ant. After some effort, he successfully killed it, acquiring its genetic fragments. At this point, the brood nest housed over 200 adult black ants, with more than 1,000 eggs, larvae, and pupae combined. Notably, the second batch of modified black ants with burrower limbs had all pupated, while the first batch of black beetle larvae remained in the larval stage. However, these larvae had grown much larger than most adult black ants. Considering the source of their genetic template and their eventual adult size, this was understandable. Although Luo Wen obtained the soldier ant template, he decided against hatching any. Their role overlapped with that of the black beetles, yet their combat effectiveness was significantly lower. Furthermore, soldier ants neither worked nor reproduced and consumed vast amounts of food. Hatching a few would be pointless. When the black beetles matured, the brood nest would be ready to expand to the surface and claim territory. Before that, Luo Wen needed to locate new ant nests. As the population in the brood nest grew rapidly, the resources from 2 nests were becoming insufficient. A few days later, Luo Wen discovered a new ant nest 200 meters north of the brood nest. He immediately forged identification pheromones and infiltrated it. The previously spacious main tunnels now seemed cramped due to Luo Wen's enlarged frame. If he continued growing, his espionage missions would likely become impossible unless he widened the passages as he went. Whether his forged identity would remain effective by then was another matter. During his earlier visit to Ant Nest No. 2's hatchery, Luo Wen had witnessed a soldier ant kill a worker ant. That worker ant wasn't a spy like Luo Wen but a legitimate native of the nest. Luo Wen still didn't understand why the attack occurred. This incident taught him that even ants from the same nest could attack each other. Over-reliance on forged identity pheromones could lead to complacency and grave mistakes. Since then, Luo Wen had been more cautious during his infiltrations. However, as his size increased, the relative threat posed by the nest's inhabitants decreased, and his confidence began to swell once more. The newly discovered ant nest number 3 was also a black ant nest, similar in scale to ant nest number 2, and showed no signs of unusual ant types. Luo Wen indulged in some nectar inside the nest and fed a few mouthfuls to some yellow bugs freeloading there before returning home to rally his forces. Leading his excavation team, he began digging a tunnel toward the new nest. The route to ant nest number 3 passed between ant nests number 1 and number 2. Using the surface posed risks of encountering scouts from either nest, complicating transportation. Thus, Luo Wen decided to dig from the transfer hub above the brood nest and excavate an underground tunnel over 200 meters long to connect directly to ant nest number 3. Given Luo Wen's size, digging a tunnel to his dimensions created a spacious and comfortable passage for the ants. While he excavated at the front, hundreds of ants transported the displaced soil behind him. Although this 200-meter tunnel was Luo Wen's largest project to date, its completion might surpass the 50-meter tunnel to ant nest number 2 in speed. A few days into the project, the newly hatched burrower ants joined the team. Their specialized digging limbs vastly outperformed ordinary appendages, akin to the difference between sweeping beans with a broom and picking them up by hand. The increase in efficiency was obvious. Everything progressed smoothly, and the new tunnel was on track for early completion. Then, something unexpected happened. After a day's work, Luo Wen returned ahead of the excavation team, leaving them to clean up the tunnel and continue their tasks. The soil removed from the tunnel had formed a mound over half a meter high above the brood nest, a testament to their efforts. Climbing to the surface, Luo Wen planned to drink some tree sap and bring some back for Big Black. Recently, the black beetle larvae modeled after Big Black had begun to pupate. Luo Wen wasn't sure if they'd remain herbivorous upon emerging, but he had started preserving the vegetation around the brood nest, consciously avoiding damage to the surrounding plant roots. While climbing a plant to find a tender branch to nibble, Luo Wen caught a glimpse of several moving patches of yellowish-brown in his peripheral vision. His senses immediately went on high alert. With the brood nest's growth, the surrounding area had become devoid of other life forms, let alone rare yellowish-brown ones. Luo Wen moved toward the figures, cautiously closing the distance until they came into clear view. To his surprise, they were the same desert ants that had nearly ended his life before. Indeed, it seemed enemies often crossed paths again. Chapter 32, Collecting some interest. Luo Wen harbored a vivid impression of the desert ants. Their hook-shaped mandibles, spring-like leaps, and their feces-spraying attacks had left a mark on his memory. Even now, he occasionally recalled those encounters, each time grinding his teeth in frustration, bitter over the storm that had swept him away, leaving him stranded in an unknown place. Would he ever return to exact vengeance for the gut-wrenching ordeal? Fate, however, worked in strange ways. To his surprise, he encountered the kin of those ants here in this foreign land, presenting him with a chance to collect some interest in advance. Luo Wen was no longer the weak creature of the past. His body had grown significantly larger, and his armor was much tougher. He decided to use these culprits' kin as practice dummies for the Luo-style insect combat technique, giving them a first-hand lesson. These yellow earth ants were about the same size as he had been back when he was just the size of a fingernail. Now, however, his body had grown to resemble a small egg. He quickly charged at the nearest yellow earth ant. On the way, he counted their numbers 7 in total, currently arranged in a tight formation as they cautiously advanced toward him. Without hesitation, he launched into the opening move of the Luo-style insect combat technique. As his massive burrowing limb smashed down on the lead ant, its comically small, round eyes, perched on its equally laughable head, froze in shock. Combined with its long, eyebrow-like antennae, the sight was absurdly amusing. But Luo Wen showed no mercy for its dazed expression. His burrowing limb struck true, and he immediately followed up with a second move. His mandibles, though relatively small compared to his body, were colossal when measured against the yellow earth ants. They resembled 2 enormous guillotine blades. Against an opponent of similar size, the second move aimed to sever their legs, crippling their mobility before slowly wearing them down. But against these much smaller foes, such elaborate techniques were unnecessary. Luo Wen's mandibles clamped down directly on the first ant's thorax, and with a slight exertion of force, the stunned yellow earth ant was torn into 2. Before its companions could react, Luo Wen repeated the process, dispatching 3 more ants in quick succession. Finally, the remaining 3 yellow earth ants came to their senses. They arched their thoraxes and thrust their abdomens forward, preparing their signature move, the feces-spraying attack. Luo Wen was unperturbed by this familiar move. He merely used his massive burrowing limbs to shield his eyes, allowing the ant's acid-laced secretion to hit his armor. Wisps of white smoke rose where the fluid landed. Since the last time he had encountered such an attack, Luo Wen's acid resistance had significantly improved. The secretion that once posed a lethal threat now merely fizzled harmlessly on his armor. As the smoke cleared, his smooth, polished armor gleamed brightly, unscathed and even shinier than before. In a blur of motion, another yellow earth ant was bitten in 2. The final 2 ants, realizing their ranged attack was ineffective, leapt forward in a desperate bid to use their hook-shaped mandibles to latch onto him. To be fair, these hook-like mandibles were highly effective against foes of a similar size, preventing their prey from escaping. Back then, these mandibles had caused Luo Wen no end of trouble, forcing him to abandon 3 segments of his abdomen to barely escape with his life. But now, facing a foe several times their size, especially one like Luo Wen, with his smooth, chitinous armor, they couldn't find any purchase, let alone immobilize him. With a mighty swing, Luo Wen's burrowing limb smashed down, crushing the comically round head of one ant. Fluid splattered everywhere. He wiped the disgusting mess off his burrowing limb on the ground. Then, with a sharp twist of his head, he clamped down on the last yellow earth ant, finishing it off with a crunch. Luo Wen reflected with a sense of accomplishment. Despite spending much of his time digging, he was now far stronger than when he was newly hatched. Back then, he had fled on sight from yellow earth ants, barely escaping death. Now, 7 of them couldn't last 2 moves against him. He tidied up the battlefield, devouring all 7 yellow earth ants. Their genetic material had long been on his wish list. However, his current interest lay solely in their spring-like leaping ability. As his body grew larger, his agility had inevitably suffered. The spring-like leap could make him more nimble in close combat. As for their hook-like mandibles and feces spraying attack, the former was too limiting. If he had rejected the giant mandible soldier ant's formidable jaws, these hooks were even less appealing. The latter, though technically an acid mixture, was also of little use. After shedding most of his ant genes with the brood nest, he barely had any residual acid left, which was now mixed into his saliva. He couldn't spare any to spray, making the ability redundant. However, these yellow earth ants could be valuable for breeding. Their combat strength far surpassed that of black ants. Even without incorporating other genetic materials, simply hatching larvae based on the yellow earth ant template could boost the hive's combat strength significantly. But where had these creatures come from? This place was quite far from the desert, and for ants, even 200 or 300 meters was a vast distance. Could there be a yellow earth ant colony nearby? Glancing at the sky, Luo Wen decided to investigate the direction the ants had come from starting tomorrow. These aggressive ants posed no threat to him, but if they continued to encroach, they could endanger the hive and the 3 ant nests. Feeling content with his current life and hopeful for the future, Luo Wen wasn't about to let these intruders ruin it. He grabbed a tender branch, sipped some sap, and brought a piece back for Big Black. Although the hive's current defenses rendered Big Black largely redundant, it had been a laborious task for the brood nest to hatch it back then. Luo Wen thought of it as keeping a pet dog. Back at the hive, Luo Wen checked on the transport and digging teams, ensuring they had all returned. After an earlier incident when a transport team went missing and wasn't discovered until the next day, Luo Wen had developed a habit of taking stock of the hive's population each night. Of course, the count was only approximate, as the bugs didn't line up for inspection but rather scurried about chaotically. Luo Wen was also somewhat face-blind when it came to insects, making an exact count impossible. Still, he could easily spot the loss of dozens. A few missing, however, would likely go unnoticed. Finding nothing amiss, Luo Wen settled into sleep. He was soon jolted awake by a cacophony of vibrations from the surface, triggering a deep sense of danger. This scenario felt eerily familiar. The last time he had been awakened by such vibrations, a sandstorm had swept through, accompanied by an ominous sense of peril. But now, far from the desert, a sandstorm seemed unlikely. Yet the vibrations this time carried an even graver threat. Chapter 33, The Legion. Luo Wen resolved to suppress his curiosity this time, no matter what, and firmly resisted the urge to investigate. Last time, his curiosity had already landed him in a situation of off you go, 1,000 miles away. This time, with the sense of danger so intense, who knew what kind of trouble might arise if he went out again. 5 minutes later, Luo Wen cautiously began crawling toward the surface. He had no intention of explaining his actions. He could only attribute them to an overpowering curiosity that he had failed to overcome. However, just as he reached the transit station near the upper levels, he discovered it had been invaded. Dense, unknown creatures crawling through the passageway were detected by the sensory hairs on his body. Could it be an ant nest invasion? He considered the possibility but dismissed it. He infiltrated the black ant's nest daily to transport food, and if there had been any major mobilization, he wouldn't have missed it. Furthermore, given the intelligence of the black ants, it seemed unlikely they could pull off an act so elaborate as to deceive and lull him into complacency. This pointed to an external species. Luo Wen was suddenly reminded of the yellow earth ants he had encountered earlier this evening, and his heart tightened. He had to take a peek. Otherwise, remaining ignorant of the enemy would leave him at too great a disadvantage. Carefully, Luo Wen made a small opening in the passage leading to the transit station and looked inside. Sure enough, the area was teeming with yellow earth ants. Could they be here for revenge? That seemed unlikely. Eliminating 7 scout worker ants shouldn't have warranted a full-scale invasion, unless one of those scouts had been someone significant, a prince or princess of a grand ant empire. If that were the case, it would be absurdly melodramatic. Luo Wen still thought it more likely to be a coincidence. Regardless, the enemy was overwhelmingly powerful and not something he could provoke at the moment. The transit station alone held hundreds of yellow earth ants, but compared to the vibrations coming from further above, this was just a small fraction of their numbers. Luo Wen estimated that at least tens of thousands of yellow earth ants were on the surface to create such strong vibrations. A mere few hundred would not have been enough for him to sense from deep underground. Without attracting the yellow earth ants' attention, Luo Wen cautiously retracted his head. Fortunately, the transit station had always been designed as a decoy, a fake nest. Directly connecting to the brood nest was inherently risky. If the nest were discovered and pursued through the passageway, a direct connection would place them in constant danger. As such, the transit station above the brood nest served as a decoy and a midpoint for food storage, with the added benefit of being misleading. Each evening, after the transport teams and excavation crews returned, all traces of the connecting passage between the brood nest and the transit station would be destroyed and buried. If any ant nest attempted to launch a surprise attack by following the passage, they would never find the brood nest's location. In fact, they might even end up attacking another ant nest instead. This strategy was known as diverting disaster eastward. While the roles of potential disaster bearers had now shifted, the diversion tactic remained effective. Luo Wen could only hope the black ants would withstand the yellow earth ants' invasion, otherwise, he would have to find a new food supply. Returning to the brood nest, Luo Wen couldn't bring himself to sleep. He focused all his senses on the activity above. Fortunately, the vibrations remained far away. The yellow earth ants had not discovered the brood nest hidden below. The vibrations from above persisted for a long time, to the point where Luo Wen began to grow numb. If the yellow earth ants were not feigning activity, merely rubbing back and forth above the brood nest, then it meant their numbers were immense, in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. Luo Wen doubted they were feigning anything. Firstly, it was unnecessary. Secondly, he could sense that the vibrations moved continuously from one end to the other, indicating the yellow earth ants were progressing in a single direction without doubling back. He realized he had underestimated them. Even though he could effortlessly dispatch 7 yellow earth ants at once, if he appeared on the surface now, he would be instantly overwhelmed by the army, unable to stir up even a ripple. Thus, Luo Wen pragmatically instructed all the insects in the brood nest to halt work and rest in place, forbidding any noise. In the dark tunnels, the insects became as silent as powered-down machines. The absence of sound made the vibrations and friction from above all the more distinct. Luo Wen couldn't fathom the scale of the colony or the abundance of resources required to sustain such a massive ant legion. He was somewhat relieved that the insects in the brood nest lacked fear. Otherwise, their minds might have already collapsed. Time passed, and the vibrations above gradually ceased. The ant army had finally moved on. But Luo Wen maintained his silence, waiting for them to get even farther away. A long time later, Luo Wen finally stirred. The yellow earth ant legion seemed to have truly moved on. His tiny brood nest wasn't worth the effort of a counterattack. Although he had his suspicions, Luo Wen cautiously moved upward. He first reached the area near the transit station, where some faint movement remained, likely yellow earth ants that had fallen behind the main army. Instead of investigating the transit station, Luo Wen bypassed it and continued upward, quietly emerging onto the surface. The temperature in this region did not fluctuate as drastically as in the desert. There was no frost at night, but the temperature was still quite low. 2 pale light sources in the sky bathed the earth in a hazy glow. The land before him seemed as though it had been plowed. The yellow earth ant legion had perfectly illustrated the meaning of an army marches through, leaving no blade of grass behind. The vegetation that had once thrived here, apart from a few sturdy trees, had vanished. At a glance, it felt as though the sky had risen by 3 feet. The desolation almost made Luo Wen feel like he had returned to the desert. A few yellow earth ants lingered in the distance, seemingly searching for something. Their poor vision prevented them from noticing Luo Wen. Even if they did, their numbers posed no threat to him now. After a quick survey of the surroundings, Luo Wen didn't linger on the surface. He turned back to the transit station and eliminated the yellow earth ants trapped there before heading toward brood nest 1. The scattered yellow earth ants along the way posed no trouble, not even slowing him down. Although their individual strength was insignificant to Luo Wen at this point, their sheer numbers, if exceeding a certain threshold, left him with no choice but to flee. This experience made Luo Wen truly understand the power of a swarm, though he regarded it with disdain. Such reliance on sheer numbers lacked any tactical sophistication. From a technical standpoint, it was far inferior to his Luo-style insect combat technique. As he thought this, his mouth inexplicably began to secrete more ant acid. Could it be because he had eaten too many ants recently? Chapter 34, Scouting the Path, 1. Luo Wen made his way to Ant Nest 1, carefully digging into the wall of the incubation chamber. He didn't rush to investigate but waited for a moment. A yellow earth ant, having heard the commotion, poked its head through the hole, only to be swiftly dealt with using a Luo-style opening strike. After dragging the splattered corpse into the passage, another round yellow head eagerly poked out. Luo Wen was unceremonious, crushing it and pulling its remains aside. Repeating the process, he took out 5 yellow earth ants that came to investigate. Then, after waiting a long while and seeing no more heads emerge, Luo Wen cautiously poked his own head inside. Though he had suspected this might be the case after seeing the yellow earth ants earlier, the scene before him still made him inhale sharply. The chamber was stripped bare. The soldier ants, worker ants, larvae, eggs, and even scraps of food had vanished, leaving the walls scraped clean, as if several layers had been peeled away. Luo Wen didn't venture further inside. Judging by the state of the incubation chamber, there was no need to inspect the rest of the nest. Even the queen ant had likely met a grim fate. Returning to the brood nest, Luo Wen considered the situation. Ant nests 2 and 3 could not be reached underground and required travel across the surface. After some deliberation, he decided to take the risk and investigate. Encountering minor troubles along the way, Luo Wen resolved them with ease. He spent some time thoroughly exploring the 2 nests. Although they were larger than Ant Nest 1, with thousands of members each, the black ants couldn't compare to the yellow earth ants in terms of individual combat strength. Even in numbers, they were utterly outclassed. Faced with the yellow earth ant legion numbering in the millions, resistance was futile. Both nests had suffered the same fate as Ant Nest 1. After dispatching a few yellow earth ants lingering in the area, Luo Wen felt the weight of the situation. This was a significant problem. His brood nest had developed rapidly, but it had done so by leeching resources from nearby ant nests. With the food supply destroyed, supporting such a large brood would no longer be easy. The situation was dire. If the issue were only the loss of the food stores, the current number of mature insects could still scavenge for sustenance. By temporarily halting the brood nest's egg production and practicing strict rationing, they might scrape through the crisis. Once the larvae matured, the brood nest could resume its expansion and development. However, this plan relied on finding food in the wild. Considering the desolation left by the yellow earth ants' passage, this was clearly not viable. Luo Wen decided to survey the surrounding areas to determine the extent of the yellow earth ant legion's destruction. If the situation proved untenable, relocating the brood nest might become necessary. Dragging several yellow earth ant corpses back to the brood nest, Luo Wen carefully preserved them. Every bit of food was precious now and could not be wasted. Reconnecting with the brood nest, Luo Wen issued commands to conserve energy and temporarily halt egg production. His size had grown rapidly due to the previously stable food supply, but the brood nest itself was now even larger than him. Moving the brood nest was still feasible for Luo Wen, but it lacked legs or wheels. Prolonged dragging would inevitably cause abrasions to its underside. If relocation became necessary, Luo Wen would need to find something to cushion it during transport. Otherwise, the brood nest wouldn't endure a long journey. Issuing additional orders to cut the insects' daily rations in half and prohibit any venturing outside, Luo Wen hurriedly left the brood nest to scout the surrounding areas. Half a day later, Luo Wen realized he had vastly underestimated the yellow earth ant legion's numbers. It far exceeded tens or even hundreds of millions. The devastation left by their passage was stark and easy to distinguish from the previous landscape. Under such circumstances, many potential dangers hidden underground had already been eradicated. For the first time, Luo Wen moved at full speed, sprinting with all his might. He avoided the few scattered yellow earth ants he encountered along the way, opting not to engage. Using the brood nest as a center, Luo Wen expanded his search radius. After half a day of exploring roughly a 1 kilometer radius, he still hadn't reached the edge of the yellow earth ant legion's ravaged territory. By this point, dawn was breaking. Luo Wen returned to the brood nest, rested briefly, and organized his thoughts. Several factors had enabled Luo Wen to cover a 1 kilometer radius in half a day. First, his exceptional vision. His compound eyes had continued to evolve, allowing him to see clearly up to 30 meters. This might not seem impressive to humans, but among insects, it was an unparalleled advantage. Second, the terrain created by the yellow earth ants. Their habit of stripping everything bare had eliminated many underground risks. With little vegetation beyond tall trees, there were few obstructions, making long-range observation easy. Third, Luo Wen's large body and long stride enabled him to move quickly. His stamina was impressive, allowing him to cover distances that would take an ordinary ant weeks to traverse. Finally, Luo Wen's search had been cursory. His goal wasn't to find anything within this territory but to gauge the extent of the yellow earth ants' destruction. Any area they had ravaged would lack sufficient resources to sustain the brood nest. These factors combined allowed Luo Wen to cover such a large area in a short time. The other insects in the brood nest could never replicate his efficiency. This meant that at least a 1 kilometer radius was devoid of food sources. Any farther was too distant for the other insects to access. Relocating the brood nest was inevitable. Finding a new nesting site required further scouting. The primary issue was the unknown extent of the yellow earth ant legion's destruction. The current circular search pattern was inefficient. Luo Wen decided on a linear approach, heading in a single direction to escape the desolation as quickly as possible. This would also make relocating the brood nest easier. After some thought, Luo Wen chose to follow the underground riverbed. It had guided him from the desert to his current location. Water was the source of life. Following the water would lead him to the next prosperous area. With the decision made, Luo Wen wasted no time. Though the brood nest still had some food reserves, rationing had only bought a few extra days. Without resupply, the reserves were unsustainable. He could not return without results, regardless of how long the search took. If delayed, the insects might not survive until his return. Determined not to waste a moment, Luo Wen sealed the brood nest, forbidding any insect from leaving. Resolute, he embarked on the journey to find a new home for life. Chapter 35, Scouting the Path, 2. The long-lost thrill of solo exploration stirred a sense of nostalgia in Luo Wen. Back then, he had been much weaker, injured, and could only dig tunnels underground to move forward cautiously. Now, however, his self-preservation capabilities had vastly improved. Even if he encountered the Yellow Earth Ant Legion head-on, his superior vision would allow him to escape in advance. The sight of countless insects in the brood nest waiting to be fed had made him restless, eager to take risks for a quick return. But once outside, the cold wind cleared his mind. After all, those insects were nothing more than mindless tools. Even the brood nest was expendable if necessary. When it came to a choice between his life and everything else, his survival would always come first. As long as he lived, he could rebuild everything. That brood nest was merely a month's work. Starting over with his experience would make recovery swift. Of course, avoiding loss was preferable. His thoughts were merely a contingency plan for the worst-case scenario. If it were just him, survival wouldn't be a concern. Luo Wen could subsist on tree bark and sap. Since drinking the fluid of a foul-smelling earthworm previously, he had absorbed certain genetic fragments and evolved accordingly. In extreme circumstances, he could even eat dirt, extracting minerals and organic matter to sustain himself. However, such measures were a last resort. To his human soul, eating dirt was far from appealing. Still, he considered incorporating this trait into his new brood members to prepare for future crises like the current one. Having resolved these thoughts, Luo Wen felt more at ease. His initially hurried pace slowed to a more measured crawl. Following the underground riverbed, Luo Wen moved forward. This time, he refrained from tunneling underground. It was too slow. While caution was essential, excessive caution would only hinder progress. Staying above ground offered a better vantage point for observation. If he encountered insurmountable obstacles, digging a tunnel could always be a fallback option. As the sky's light slowly brightened, the land ravaged by the yellow earth ants remained desolate. Even the insects' usual calls were absent. He crawled for what seemed like an eternity through this barren wasteland. Not even the foul-smelling earthworms he once found inedible were in sight. Luo Wen clicked his mandibles in astonishment. The Yellow Earth Ant Legion must number in the tens of millions to have caused such widespread destruction. Along the way, he encountered a few stray yellow earth ants and promptly sent them to meetings in his stomach. With food replenishment, his fatigue vanished. Ahead, the sound of rushing water reached him, and the air grew increasingly humid. As he pressed on, the moisture became visible as a mist, and the sound of water grew deafening. A short distance further, Luo Wen discovered the source of the commotion. The ground ahead abruptly dropped off, forming a sheer cliff tens of meters high. The underground river cascaded over the edge, creating a waterfall that plunged into a small lake below, sending mist into the air and generating a thunderous roar. Carefully, Luo Wen crawled to the cliff's edge. Back when he was human, he had a fear of heights. Just looking down from the 5th floor could make his legs tremble. The last time he was hurled into the air, the surrounding darkness had obscured the height, so his fear hadn't been triggered. After cautiously peeking over the edge, he realized his acrophobia hadn't resurfaced this time. Apparently, the problem had miraculously resolved itself after he became an insect. Acrophobia, at its core, was a psychological barrier. Perhaps the experience of his previous fall had instilled confidence that a mere drop wouldn't kill him. With that belief, the fear naturally dissipated. This small victory brought Luo Wen some joy. After all, overcoming a personal weakness was worth celebrating. The scene below was somewhat blurred. The cliff was beyond Luo Wen's clear vision range, forcing him to rely on patches of indistinct colors. He inferred that the waterfall fed a lake surrounded by a band of green. Those green patches were plants. Unlike the devastation above, the area below remained untouched by the yellow earth ants, preserving its ecosystem. Perhaps the cliff had diverted the ants' path. Now, Luo Wen faced a new challenge: how to descend safely. The rocky cliff beneath him rendered his burrowing limbs useless. Should he simply jump? After all, a fall wouldn't kill him. Deciding to scout further along the cliff edge, Luo Wen ruled out the idea of leaping from the initial spot. It was directly above the lake. Without any water combat experience, he would be helpless against aquatic threats. Crawling several hundred meters along the edge, he finally saw something different. Below him was no longer the blue-gray of water but the vivid greens of treetops. This area was farther from the waterfall, and the cliff's surface was rougher, unlike the smooth, water-eroded rock he had seen before. Examining the area carefully, Luo Wen looked for a way down. His 6 hind limbs, equipped with sharp hooks, could help him descend if the cliff wasn't entirely smooth. Spotting a crack in the rock filled with rubble and moss, Luo Wen carefully latched his claws onto the surface and began his descent. His sturdy shoulder and back plates, while providing excellent defense, added significant weight. While this hadn't been an issue on solid ground, the strain became evident as he hung suspended. Fortunately, his hooked claws, though slender and seemingly fragile, were incredibly durable. Coupled with his powerful limbs, they kept him securely anchored to the rock. As he descended closer to the ground, his vision gradually clarified. Proximity to the water source had created a lush, verdant landscape below. The soil was entirely covered in green. The vegetation here was distinctly different from the barren landscape above. Luo Wen wasn't a botanist, so he couldn't classify them. However, their appearance clearly indicated a unique ecosystem. The vibrancy of the scene excited Luo Wen. The dense foliage promised not only an abundance of resources but also a diverse array of insect species and genetic fragments. From the undergrowth came unfamiliar insect calls, piquing Luo Wen's excitement. Finally, he would meet new friends. Hopefully, they'd appreciate his Luo-style combat techniques. But just as he neared the ground 5 or 6 meters away, a sudden movement from a crevice caught his eye. An indigenous creature launched a surprise attack. Chapter 36, Ambush. The native creature closely matched the color of the cliff rock, camouflaging itself within a crevice. It had remained utterly motionless, blending seamlessly with the surroundings, and Luo Wen, focused on the greenery below, failed to notice the seemingly lifeless form was, in fact, alive. Luckily, Luo Wen's evolving eyes, with their now 30-meter range and heightened refresh rate, caught the creature's movement the instant it struck. The figure leaping toward him became vividly clear, a spider-like creature, gargantuan in size, several times larger than Luo Wen himself. Its body resembled a fortress, divided into 2 segments, the cephalothorax and a rounded, hair-covered abdomen. Its head bore 8 black, spherical eyes arranged in 3 rows, 4 small ones in front, 2 larger ones in the middle, and 2 more small ones at the back. At its mouth, a pair of chelicerae arched forward, exposing sharp, venomous fangs. It had 8 sturdy striding limbs, each jointed for exceptional mobility. Covered in hair and tipped with small claws and barbs, the legs spread wide, forming a deadly net as it leaped to envelop Luo Wen with its massive frame. Luo Wen had thought his own size made him a giant among insects, dominating worker ants in the desert. But this new environment wasted no time humbling him. The first creature he encountered dwarfed him completely. He had no interest in discovering what would happen if he was caught under the massive web-like trap. Nor was he keen on testing his carapace against those venomous fangs. To make matters worse, his current position on the cliff left him no room for agile maneuvers. Realizing the ground was close, Luo Wen decided to release his hooks and drop, hoping to both evade the attack and reach safety below. But the spider was faster. As Luo Wen detached from the cliff, one of its hairy limbs lashed out like lightning, snagging him mid-fall. Luo Wen reacted instantly, raising a sturdy burrower limb to shield himself. The spider's barbed limb bristled with backward-facing hooks, clinging tightly to Luo Wen's digging limb the moment they made contact. The spider, clearly experienced in handling prey attempting to escape via freefall, began reeling him back in. With horrifying efficiency, its venomous fangs advanced. Damn it! Luo Wen cursed, fear mingling with fury. He had underestimated the creature, whose unique adaptations made it a master predator. His attempted escape had played right into its strengths. The hooked hairs, though seemingly delicate, were incredibly strong. Despite his frantic struggles, Luo Wen couldn't break free from their grip. The spider's fangs clamped down on his burrower limb. Though his carapace held for a brief moment, cracks soon formed under the pressure. Finally, the fangs punctured through to the soft muscle beneath, and a numbing sensation spread through Luo Wen's body. Damn it! Luo Wen cursed again, furious and alarmed. The creature's venom was potent, and the situation was quickly deteriorating. If this stalemate continued, his life would be forfeit. Desperation ignited his survival instincts. Luo Wen brought his powerful jaws to bear, biting through the joint of his trapped limb with all his strength. The moment he severed his digging limb, the spider reared back, and Luo Wen seized the chance to break free. With a coordinated push from his 6 remaining legs, he launched himself away using his newly evolved burst speed. In an instant, he was a blur of motion, a dark shadow leaping from the cliff crevice and tumbling to the ground below. The spider extended itself in pursuit, but despite its 8 eyes, it was clearly nearsighted. Luo Wen, now on the forest floor, was beyond its visual range. Frustrated, the spider retreated, retreating back into its crevice with the severed limb still clutched in its fangs. Moments later, the crevice was as silent and still as before. Luo Wen landed in a patch of undergrowth, hastily shoving aside grass to dig into the soil. With one limb missing, his digging speed had slowed, but he pressed on, seeking the safety of the earth. His wound continued to throb and numb, the venom melting away his muscle tissue. The severity of the toxin left Luo Wen both horrified and enraged. Damn it! That thing plays dirty, venomous, and extremely venomous at that. Gritting his mandibles, he bit off the base of his severed limb to prevent the venom from spreading further. Scraping his jaws clean on the dirt, he muttered to himself. If the venom reached his mouth, he couldn't very well bite off his own head. After digging for what felt like hours, Luo Wen detected no other life nearby. Exhausted, he resorted to eating soil, a necessity he had never expected to face so soon. Although the taste was dreadful, it sustained him. He ate his fill before succumbing to sleep, his body beginning the long process of self-repair. Time passed. When Luo Wen finally awoke, he examined his body. He hadn't cocooned this time, but a new digging limb had grown in place of the old one. The new limb was significantly smaller than its counterpart, making Luo Wen look oddly mismatched with his uneven appendages. This is going to drive my OCD insane, he muttered, feeling a pang of frustration. Still, he was confident his genes would correct the disparity as long as his nutrition intake was sufficient. His stomach growled, spurring Luo Wen to crawl upward. He resolved to minimize his dirt consumption. Its energy conversion rate was dismal. It had also given him his first experience with insect digestion issues, a situation he hoped to avoid in the future. Near the surface, Luo Wen encountered a tangle of roots. Biting through a few, he drank the sap to replenish his fluids. As he carefully poked his head out of the ground, a nearby grasshopper-like insect leapt away with astonishing speed. Despite its quickness, Luo Wen clearly captured its appearance. That looks like a grasshopper, he observed. The insect was an oily green, resembling a locust. Its powerful hind legs marked it as a champion jumper, though it lacked wings. Its back was covered in a hard shell that split open during jumps, helping it maintain balance mid-air. Chapter 37, Discovery. The grasshopper's abilities were impressive, especially its powerful hind legs. Unfortunately, it was highly alert. Luo Wen barely rustled the grass before it leaped away. Though it didn't jump far, the lush vegetation severely hampered his eagle eye ability in this environment. No matter how sharp his vision was, it wasn't X-ray capable, he couldn't see through the dense underbrush. With his greatest advantage on the surface nullified, moving underground once more seemed safer. The ground near the lake was moist, and Luo Wen soon sensed movement. Approaching cautiously, he found a worm. This worm was different from the foul-smelling, ambush-prone one he'd encountered before. Its dark red body was less grotesque and lacked the repulsive stench. It wriggled through the soil with rhythmic undulations. To Luo Wen, such a chance meeting was fate. He decided to take a bite. The more genetic fragments he added to his gene pool, the better. Who knew when they might come in handy? The foul-smelling worm's ability to extract nutrition from dirt had been invaluable in a crisis, even if the experience of consuming it was unpleasant. Encountering a new species of worm presented an opportunity to gain another useful trait. Perhaps by collecting and combining different worms' abilities, Luo Wen could eventually achieve the ultimate dirt-eating efficiency without any digestive side effects. Grabbing one end of the worm, Luo Wen unceremoniously shoved its dirt-covered body into his mouth. This worm was unimpressive, offering no resistance to his attack. Perhaps due to his prior experience with far worse flavors, the earthy taste and faint stench of this worm were relatively tolerable. After consuming half the worm, Luo Wen let it go. Remarkably, even with half its body gone, the worm remained lively, burrowing into the soil and disappearing within moments. Its vitality was enviable, but Luo Wen already possessed the ability to regenerate lost limbs. The absorbed genetic fragments seemed to enhance his recovery further, subtly strengthening his resilience. Still, he was far more interested in the spider that had ambushed him on the cliff. Obtaining its genetic fragments could be transformative. Although spiders weren't insects, Luo Wen wasn't a traditional bug, either. The Ephi-ish species to which he belonged defied Earth's definitions. While they resembled insects during their early stages, their genetic makeup was a patchwork of various creatures. If categorized, they were more akin to a swarm species than true insects. At this point, Luo Wen might be the last surviving member of his kind. Pondering his battle with the spider, Luo Wen recognized the vast disparity in power. A direct confrontation was hopeless, especially given its venom. Without poison, he might have been able to rely on his armor to endure. But the spider's venom rendered its attacks devastating. If a solo fight was out of the question, perhaps overwhelming it with numbers could work. By rallying his brood, Luo Wen could emulate the yellow earth ants, sacrificing weaker individuals to exhaust the spider's venom reserves before swarming it. The plan was feasible and aligned with his goal of building a collective. Not everything had to be a solo effort. For now, finding a new nesting site took priority. Once he had secured a location, he could bring the rest of his swarm. An ideal site would be near ant nests, as ants were plentiful and provided valuable resources. It didn't take long for Luo Wen to encounter a familiar network of tunnels underground. Emerging onto the surface, he spotted numerous black ants. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were the same species as the black ants from the desert. This discovery simplified matters. Luo Wen altered his pheromones and brazenly infiltrated the black ant's nest. The layout of the tunnels felt familiar, and Luo Wen followed the largest pathway to the incubation chamber, where he found some old acquaintances. As the saying goes, old enemies meet, and sparks fly. A few well-aimed acid spits dispatched them. After examining the incubation and storage chambers, along with the number of soldier ants, Luo Wen estimated the nest contained over 5,000 members. The abundance of resources near the lake was evident. Even a randomly encountered ant nest dwarfed those in the desert. After a hearty meal courtesy of the black ant's supplies, Luo Wen emerged from the nest and began scouting the surrounding area. The presence of such a large nest suggested the absence of major threats. Otherwise, the relatively weak black ants couldn't have grown to this size. Luo Wen decided to explore above ground. The underground offered little beyond roots and worms, while the surface held the promise of diverse genetic material. Cautiously crawling through the underbrush, he occasionally startled grasshoppers of various colors and sizes. These grasshoppers typically rested on grass blades and were highly vigilant. Luo Wen's size made silent approaches nearly impossible, so he hadn't yet had the chance to showcase his talents to them. He also encountered numerous new insects, though most lacked distinctive traits worth assimilating. Having recently feasted, Luo Wen wasn't particularly hungry and didn't bother engaging them. Among his discoveries were many black ants foraging for food. Underneath a rock, a group of worker ants was dragging out a segmented, half-cylindrical insect covered in a tough carapace. This creature had numerous joints and small legs but had curled into a ball to defend itself. The worker ants couldn't breach its armor but surrounded it persistently. Whenever the insect attempted to uncurl and escape, they swarmed it, forcing it to retreat into its defensive posture. This was only delaying the inevitable. A massive soldier ant, guided by several workers, was making its way through the grass. Soon, the battle resumed. The armored insect's defenses were no match for the soldier ant's formidable weaponry. After a few exchanges, it lay gravely wounded, its body severely damaged. The workers swarmed over it, dismembering it into smaller pieces for transport back to the nest. Elsewhere, Luo Wen noticed black ants on plant stems, tending to green, translucent aphids. Surprisingly, the ants didn't attack the aphids but patrolled around them diligently. Periodically, the aphids lifted their abdomens, excreting a sticky liquid, which the worker ants scraped up with their mandibles. Moments later, the ants regurgitated a semi-solid, jelly-like substance, feeding it mouth to mouth to their companions. Watching this, Luo Wen recalled eating something similar in the ant nest earlier. The sweet, syrupy flavor had been quite enjoyable. Now, however, the thought of its origin filled him with nausea. Chapter 38, The Migration, 1. Luo Wen deeply regretted his sharp eyesight and cursed himself for watching the entire process. A rare delicacy, why did he have to witness how it was made? How could he bring himself to eat it now? It was a devastating blow to a foodie like him. He turned away, determined not to look again, and focused on scouting the area. With his view obstructed, Luo Wen managed to search only a few hundred meters around him before nightfall. He discovered 4 ant nests, all belonging to black ants. These nests were relatively large, likely due to their ability to rear other insects. A more diverse food supply allowed them to sustain a larger population. As for a new location to establish his own nest, Luo Wen had made his choice. He selected the intersection at the center of the 4 black ant nests. While it was somewhat risky, Luo Wen had become quite adept at concealing his lair. These black ants could only dig so deep underground. Luo Wen planned to build his nest in the deeper layers, as he had done before. Above this, he would construct a transit station completely disconnected from the main nest below. The subterranean brood nest would be like an isolated island, only linked to the upper transit station during food transportation. With his mission accomplished, it was time to return. It was already late, so Luo Wen decided to rest for the night and head back at dawn. The next morning, Luo Wen emerged from the ground, stopped by a nearby ant nest to snag a meal, and began crawling towards the cliff. Recalling his harrowing experience on the cliff last time, Luo Wen decided to scale a different section. His hooked claws gripped the rocky surface tightly as he hoisted his body upward. Climbing was a physically demanding task, especially for someone of Luo Wen's rounded physique. His size required extra effort, but it also came with advantages. His sturdy, powerful limbs allowed him to better withstand strong winds. It was a double-edged sword. Carefully, he examined the cracks in the cliff, staying vigilant for any sudden ambushes. If attacked, Luo Wen was prepared to launch himself away instantly, even if it meant starting the climb over. This time, however, he encountered no attacks. It seemed the cliff-dwelling spiders were few and far between, and he had simply been unlucky the last time. It took him the entire day to climb the cliff. By evening, he finally reached the top, exhausted from the effort. The extended time was due to the grueling nature of the climb and a period of strong winds during which he had to take shelter in a rock crevice. Only when the winds subsided did he resume his ascent. The desert above the cliff presented minimal danger, so Luo Wen decided to travel through the night. By the following evening, with only a few brief rests, Luo Wen had completed the journey in 1 day and 1 night. A trip that had previously taken him over 2 days was now halved. Calculating the time spent, Luo Wen estimated that the entire round trip, including time for recuperative rest, had taken about a week. Back at the brood nest, everything was mostly intact, except for the depleted food stores. There were no other losses. Most of the insects were conserving energy by lying motionless on the ground. Only a few smaller worker ants were feeding the larvae. Luo Wen also spotted over a dozen tiny black beetles nearby. It seemed the first batch of cultivated eggs had finally matured into adults. Unsealing the chamber housing the brood nest, Luo Wen provided it with some food before linking with it and uploading the newly acquired gene fragments. As for the migration of the nest, Luo Wen had devised a plan during his journey back. The current nest population, including adults, larvae, pupae, and unhatched eggs, exceeded 1,000 individuals. Adults comprised the majority, followed by pupae and larvae. Since the brood nest had long ceased laying eggs under Luo Wen's orders, there were only a few unhatched eggs left. Luo Wen instructed the insects to consume all remaining food. Each adult was to carry a larva, pupa, or egg. Luo Wen himself would connect to the brood nest, while the black beetles formed a phalanx beneath it, linking their armored backs together to create a makeshift platform to support and transport the brood nest. With everything prepared, the migration began in earnest. Burrower ants took the lead, digging a tunnel to the surface. Although communication with Big Black was impossible, Luo Wen had initially intended to leave it behind. However, when Luo Wen and the black beetles began dragging the brood nest out, Big Black trailed closely behind. On the desolate landscape, a giant beetle pulled a fleshy lump, which was visibly supported by numerous smaller beetles below. Behind them followed hundreds of ants, each clutching larvae or pupae in their mandibles. This motley crew of disparate insects marched in harmony, united in their slow but purposeful advance. The procession's speed was inevitably slower than Luo Wen's solo pace. At their current rate, it would take about a week to reach the cliff. The black beetles fared relatively well, occasionally finding tender tree branches to sustain themselves. The ants, however, could only lick tree sap for hydration. Luo Wen wasn't sure how long they could survive on just water. Determined to ensure future resilience, Luo Wen resolved to incorporate soil-eating genes into the next batch of larvae. At least then, hunger wouldn't be as dire an issue. Each evening, Luo Wen led the insects in excavating a temporary burrow. The nights were chilly, and while the adults could manage, the larvae suffered. On the first night, Luo Wen overlooked this issue, resulting in the loss of all remaining eggs and several larvae. Pupae were unaffected, but 2 newly emerged adults also succumbed to the cold. Insects, being protein-based, didn't go to waste. Luo Wen ordered the others to consume the dead to replenish their energy. As they journeyed onward, even the sparse yellow earth ants seemed to vanish. Days passed without encountering a single one. A week later, the migration army finally reached the cliff. Their numbers had dwindled from over 1,000 to just over 900. Losses occurred daily due to various reasons. Most fatalities were larvae that failed to survive the inadequate nutrition, followed by weak newly emerged adults or individuals lost along the way. Whatever the cause, those were now in the past. They had achieved their initial goal. But ahead of them lay an even greater challenge. Chapter 39, The Migration, 2. Luo Wen led the migrating swarm to the safe route he had scouted earlier. After a bit of adjustment, the army began their descent. At this stage, the black beetles were of little use. Luo Wen selected several large worker ants and positioned them around the brood nest. Each ant bit onto a corner of the nest, and together, they lifted it incrementally toward the cliff. Luo Wen took the lead, acting as the base by propping the brood nest up from below with his body. Around him, 7 or 8 ants stabilized the nest, ensuring it didn't tip over. The rest of the insects began following suit, climbing down the cliff in an orderly manner. As the swarm moved slowly along the cliff face, Luo Wen bore the immense weight of the brood nest with his mandibles and digging limbs. Despite his robust body and sturdy limbs, he found it increasingly difficult to bear the strain. To make matters worse, as the swarm reached the midpoint of the climb, the previously mild winds began to intensify. The increasing wind pressure took a toll on the swarm. The strong winds caused some ants to lose their grip, their mandibles releasing larvae or pupae, which were immediately swept away. Others couldn't hold on to the cliff at all, plummeting into the abyss below. Luo Wen couldn't spare attention to the others. His own situation had become precarious. 2 of the ants gripping the brood nest were blown away, while 3 others clung on with only their mandibles. Their bodies flailed helplessly in the wind. The loss of several ants destabilized the brood nest's center of gravity. The remaining ants, along with Luo Wen, struggled to keep it steady in the fierce wind. The nest toppled backward off Luo Wen's head. He clamped onto it with his mandibles, trying to catch it. However, the downward force of the falling nest pulled Luo Wen away from the cliff, and they plummeted together. During the fall, the wind shifted their trajectory slightly. Fortunately, the combined weight of Luo Wen and the brood nest lessened the impact, and the drop was only about 20 meters. They landed in a dense thicket below, which cushioned the fall. The brood nest, being naturally tough, sustained no damage. Luo Wen, with his experience from past falls, was also unscathed. 5 worker ants that had been attached to the nest fell alongside it. Being lighter, they were only slightly disoriented and otherwise unharmed. Luo Wen quickly dug a pit and buried the brood nest to protect it. He then started marking pheromone trails along the cliff base to guide the scattered insects. By nightfall, Luo Wen had only managed to gather a few dozen insects, including 2 black beetles, 1 burrower ant, and several worker ants, along with a few larvae and pupae. With no other options, he decided to rest for the night. The following day, he spent the entire time gathering more insects but only managed to find a few dozen more. Combined with the previous day's count, the swarm now totaled barely over 100. The cliff crossing had been devastating. While the week-long march through the desert had cost only a little over 100 insects, the cliff climb had claimed several hundred in just a few hours. Further searching was futile. Thankfully, the brood nest remained intact. After another night's rest, Luo Wen unearthed the brood nest and set off toward the new nest location with the remnants of the swarm. The reduced numbers weren't entirely a disadvantage. The survivors were mostly robust adults, with only a few larvae and pupae. Luo Wen hauled the brood nest himself, supported below by black beetles and several ants. With fewer insects to slow them down, their travel speed increased significantly, and their smaller size made them less conspicuous. Previously, Luo Wen had worried that the swarm's size would make it difficult to remain hidden while traversing multiple ant nests to reach the central location. That concern was now moot. The new nest site was only 300 to 400 meters from the cliff. The streamlined migration party reached it quickly. On the way, they encountered a few scout ants from an unknown nest. After Luo Wen demonstrated his performance skills, the scouts contributed their bodies to the swarm's long overdue feast. Upon arrival, Luo Wen assigned 2 burrower ants to start digging. One had been found the previous day, and the other was located during the journey. The worker ants assisted by carrying the excavated soil outside. Meanwhile, Luo Wen circled the new nest site, using his pheromones to mark the area as a no trespassing zone. This precaution aimed to deter scout ants from disturbing the insects at work. The excavation progressed rapidly once Luo Wen joined in. After all, he had previously managed to dig out a nest alone while hauling the brood nest. Now, with his significantly larger size and dozens of strong helpers, the work advanced even faster. A small mound of soil began forming at the entrance, evidence of the soil being transported out. Due to the proximity to a water source, the soil was moist, and the underground environment was damp. Luo Wen recalled observing the nearby ant nests, where he had noticed many areas lined with fine sand and wood shavings. He had even seen ants removing moldy shavings from their nests. At the time, he hadn't understood the purpose, but now, as he dug his own nest, the reason became clear. He marveled at how these seemingly simple creatures had developed survival strategies passed down over countless generations. Such knowledge was the crystallization of time. Luo Wen's own experience as an insect was brief, so absorbing these accumulated lessons was the best way to build his foundation. The pheromone barrier proved effective. By nightfall, no scout ants had ventured into the area. The insects had dug a small chamber about 7 or 8 meters underground. They couldn't go deeper due to water seepage, which made the soil unstable and prone to collapse. Even the current depth would require significant reinforcement to ensure safety. With the main nest unfinished and uninhabitable, Luo Wen dug a temporary nest about a meter underground to house the brood nest. In case of an emergency, the brood nest could be buried quickly, and the insects would scatter to draw attention away, ensuring its safety. Though an attack was unlikely, Luo Wen ensured all precautions were in place. He ventured out again to perform, returning with a few more victims to feed the swarm and the brood nest. By the following day, the simplified nest should be complete. After some basic reinforcement, it would be ready for temporary use. Once the brood nest resumed production, they could expand and fortify the nest further, including constructing transportation tunnels to link the surrounding ant nests, a task that would require a substantial workforce. Chapter 40, Development and Conflict. 2 leisurely months passed, and the insect hive underwent a dramatic transformation. Above the hive, a decoy transit station had been established. 4 spacious tunnels now connected it to the surrounding 4 ant nests. Worker ants scurried back and forth through these tunnels, transporting food from the ant nests to the transit station. Each evening, the tunnels between the transit station and the hive were reopened, allowing the food to be transferred into the hive. Above the transit station, the soil excavated during the digging of the hive and tunnels had been piled into a tall mound. This mound not only prevented rainwater from flooding the tunnels but also concealed large, unprocessed food stores, including the corpses of numerous sentry worker ants. Thanks to the steady influx of resources from the 4 ant nests, the hive thrived. The number of adult insects exceeded 1,000, and there were over 2,000 eggs, pupae, and larvae. These newly bred insects were not ordinary ants. Their genes had undergone significant upgrades, transforming them into hybrids that retained the appearance and behavior of ants but were composed of traits from multiple insect species. When the temporary hive was first established, Luo Wen had instructed the brood nest to produce over 200 burrower ant eggs, incorporating soil-eating genes to ensure their survival in the harsh early conditions. Burrower ants were not only capable of performing all the functions of regular worker ants but also excelled at excavation. The 4 connecting tunnels, spanning over 1,000 meters in total, were a testament to the capabilities of these new ants. With the tunnels completed and a stable food supply secured, Luo Wen shifted focus to breeding worker ants equipped with formic acid spraying abilities. These ants had poor close combat skills but excelled in food transport and long-range combat support. The next step involved developing new soldier ants. Using the standard soldier ant template, Luo Wen integrated various gene fragments. These upgrades resulted in visible differences in their weaponry. Some bore the hook-shaped mandibles of yellow earth ants, others had enlarged mandibles resembling those of black ants, and a few were equipped with massive jaws akin to those of black beetles. In addition to enhanced weaponry, the new soldier ants inherited the robustness of black beetles, combined with their original soldier ant traits. As a result, their mature forms were significantly larger and more powerful than standard soldier ants. There were also a few specialized breeds. Among them were scout bugs, equipped with exceptional vision capable of seeing over 20 meters. However, their limited intelligence hindered their ability to report findings effectively, necessitating further upgrades. Another innovation was the spy bug. With the 4 ant nests spread out, Luo Wen couldn't personally infiltrate them and transport food daily. Thus, he developed this species, capable of altering their pheromones to blend in. Unfortunately, their limited intelligence initially resulted in poor performance. However, after a month of meticulous training under Luo Wen's guidance, the spy bugs eventually learned to complete their tasks independently. Despite occasional shortcomings, they became responsible for stealing food from the ant nests, a decision Luo Wen made with careful consideration. The spy bugs had decent safety measures. Black ants couldn't detect their disguises and, at most, noticed the traces they left behind in the stolen tunnels. Even if the theft was discovered, Luo Wen wasn't worried. The hive had grown considerably in strength. Although the ant nests outnumbered the hive several times over, Luo Wen was confident in his ability to defeat them if necessary. If not for the efficiency of the worker ants, some of the nearby ant nests might have already been eliminated. Just a few days ago, the southeastern ant nest discovered one of the stolen tunnels. Several scout worker ants infiltrated it, followed by a significant military force. The hive responded immediately. The transport team worker ants, doubling as scouts, marked the retreat path with pheromones as they slowly withdrew from the tunnel. Soon, the hive's soldier ant corps entered the tunnel, and the transport worker ants stopped retreating, falling in behind the soldiers as they advanced toward the battlefield. When the two forces met, there was no preamble, they clashed instantly. The soldier ants blocked the tunnel while worker ants launched surprise attacks, biting antennae and pulling at limbs. However, the hive's side had a trump card, a ranged attack formation. Several rounds of formic acid sprays devastated the enemy worker ants, inflicting heavy casualties. Even the more durable soldier ants suffered burns to their eyes and antennae. The hive's insects, having been modified with acid-resistant genes, were unaffected by the sprays. Aside from gaining a glossy sheen on their carapaces, they sustained no damage. Without the support of their worker ants, the ant nest's soldiers couldn't withstand the hive's fully intact army. The hive's worker ants swarmed them, immobilizing their limbs and leaving them vulnerable to the giant mandible soldier ants, who swiftly decapitated them. Led by the soldier ants, the hive forces broke through the enemy ranks. Some worker ants followed closely, while others lagged behind to finish off injured foes. The assault reached the enemy's incubation chamber. Only Luo Wen's intervention prevented the hive from completely annihilating the nest. As the losing side, the ant nest had no choice but to accept defeat quietly. Post-battle reports revealed that the hive had lost 9 soldier ants and several dozen worker ants, while the enemy nest suffered devastating losses, 71 soldier ants and nearly 1,000 worker ants, leaving it crippled. The hive, despite its losses, gained a substantial haul of ant corpses, a valuable protein-rich resource. Most of these war spoils were stored in the mound above the transit station. However, food supplies from the defeated nest sharply declined afterward. This prompted Luo Wen to reflect deeply. Why resort to such hostility? Couldn't disputes be resolved peacefully? Even if conflict was unavoidable, couldn't it have been less severe? Though leading the swarm's charge had been exhilarating, crippling the ant nest ultimately hindered the hive's growth. In a gesture of goodwill, Luo Wen temporarily closed the stolen tunnel to allow the nest time to recover. Fortunately, its eggs remained unharmed. Luo Wen hoped that with this recovery policy, the nest would soon resume its role as a resource provider and perform even better. Luo Wen didn't participate directly in the battle, as his significantly larger size rendered him unsuitable for the tunnels. His involvement would have blocked pathways and hindered the effectiveness of the swarm. Reflecting on the war, Luo Wen noticed a marked increase in the intelligence of this new generation of insects. Previously, they behaved like simple machines, requiring constant instructions. Now, they displayed traits akin to rudimentary AI, capable of performing complex tasks and even learning. What caused this change? Luo Wen speculated it might be the hive's continuous growth or the interaction of diverse gene fragments. This was merely a hypothesis, requiring further observation and experimentation. Regardless of the cause, Luo Wen regarded this development as a promising sign.